On May 11th, 1920, the most powerful crime boss in Chicago was found dead in the entryway of his own restaurant. The man who had built a huge criminal empire refused to change with the times, and it cost him everything. This is the story of Big Jim Colosimo, the forgotten crime leader who prepared the way for Al Capone, but who made one terrible choice that decided his future. Tonight, we explore the rise and fall of Chicago's very first true crime king. Before we start this amazing true story, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Are you relaxing at the end of your day? Or maybe you are listening while you are working. Write a comment below, and if you are prepared for a detailed look at one of history's most interesting gangsters, please click that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy true crime. It truly supports the growth of this channel. Now, let's travel back to 1878, to a small town in southern Italy where our story starts. February 16th, 1878, Colosimo, province of Cosenza, Calabria, Italy. In the rough hills of Calabria, where old olive trees grew on steep mountainsides and being poor was as common as the rocks themselves, Vincenzo Colosimo was born. His parents, Luigi Colosimo and his second wife, Giuseppina Mascaro, had very little to give their son except for their love, their faith, and the small hope that somehow, someplace, life might be better. Colosimo was not a place that was mentioned in grand Italian history books. It was a town where time appeared to pass more slowly than in the rest of the world. It was a place where families of farmers worked the same hard ground their ancestors had worked for generations. It was a place where the sound of church bells marked the only important happenings. The men worked until their backs were bent forever. The women had children and prayed. The children grew up understanding that this difficult life was probably all they would ever experience. But young Vincenzo was different. Even when he was a boy, he had a quality that made him stand out. He had ambition. While other kids appeared to accept that they would inherit their father's poverty, Vincenzo watched the occasional traveler come through the village and thought about where they might be going. He paid close attention to stories about America, with an intensity that made his mother worried. America, the place where they said the streets were covered with gold. America, where a man could become anything he dreamed of, no matter what name he was given at birth or how much property his father owned. The Italy of Vincenzo's youth was a country that was still discovering its own identity. The Risorgimento, the movement to unite Italy, had been finished less than 10 years before he was born. But for the people of the poor South, not much had improved. If anything, conditions had become worse. The new Italian government appeared to care more about the industrial North than the farming South. Taxes went up. Opportunities stayed gone. The land could barely feed the people who worked it. By the time Vincenzo was a teenager, southern Italy was going through a huge wave of people leaving. Whole villages were becoming empty as people escaped to America, Argentina, Australia, anywhere that offered a chance at something better than slowly starving. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians would leave for America alone. They crowded into the lowest class sections of steamships, carrying with them nothing but hope and desperation. In 1891, when Vincenzo Colosimo was 13 years old, he made the choice that would change everything. He would go to America. He would go to Chicago. We do not know for sure what Luigi and Giuseppina thought when their son told them he was leaving. Did they try to talk him out of it? Did they support his decision? Did his mother cry as she packed his few belongings? Did his father press whatever small amount of money they could give into his rough hands? History does not record these personal moments. What we do know is that sometime in 1891, Vincenzo Colosimo got on a ship headed for America, leaving behind everything he had ever known. The trip across the Atlantic in the lowest class was a nightmare that would stay with immigrants for the rest of their lives. Hundreds of people were packed into dark, airless spaces below the waterline. The smell of unwashed bodies, vomit, and human waste was everywhere. Sickness spread quickly in those conditions. Many people did not survive the voyage. Those who did make it arrived at their destination, changed forever by the experience. But Vincenzo lived, and when he finally saw the Statue of Liberty rising up in New York Harbor, when he went through the processing center at Ellis Island, when he got on the train that would carry him west to Chicago, he must have believed that every moment of suffering had been worth it. He was in America. He had made it. He had no way of knowing that the America waiting for him would be so different from the one he had dreamed about. Chicago, 1891, the First Ward. If Vincenzo Colosimo thought he would find streets covered with gold when he got to Chicago, he was quickly shown that idea was wrong. What he discovered instead was the First Ward, one of the most dishonest, crime-filled, and dangerous areas in the whole country. The First Ward was a place of sharp opposites. On one side, it contained the Loop, Chicago's main business district with its fancy hotels, big department stores, and the impressive new buildings that were making the city well known. On the other side was the Levee, a red-light district so notorious that its name became a symbol for wickedness. Here, in a small area roughly bordered by 18th and 22nd Streets, and between Clark Street and Wabash Avenue, there was a constant carnival of corruption that ran with the complete knowledge and protection of the city's political leaders. In the Levee, there were more than 200 houses of prostitution. They ranged from cheap $1 rooms where sickness and hopelessness were everywhere, to fancy places with mirrored walls and champagne. There were places where people smoked opium and could lose themselves in drug dreams. There were gambling houses where money changed owners every night. There were bars on every corner, places where a working man could forget his problems for the cost of a beer, and where deals about crimes were made over whiskey. Two men ruled the First Ward with a tight grip hidden inside gentle gloves. Alderman Michael Hinky Dink Kenna and Alderman John Bathhouse John Coughlin. They were a strange pair. Kenna was short, quiet, and smart. He was the brains of the operation. Coughlin was flashy, loud, and acted as the public face of their partnership. Together, they had made the First Ward into their own private moneymaker, collecting payments for protection from every illegal business owner, delivering votes to the Democratic Party, and making sure the police ignored things when necessary. When 17-year-old Vincenzo Colosimo arrived in this world, barely able to speak English, knowing nobody, and carrying everything he owned in a single beat-up suitcase, he must have felt completely lost. The Chicago he found was nothing like the peaceful village he had left behind. It was noisy, filthy, crowded, and dangerous. The streets were not paved with gold. They were covered with horse manure and broken dreams. Immigrants like Vincenzo were pouring into Chicago by the thousands. Most of them settled in ethnic neighborhoods where they could at least talk to their neighbors. The Italians gathered in the First Ward and in areas on the near north and near west sides. Life in these communities was difficult. Most immigrants took whatever jobs they could get, laying railroad tracks, working in the stockyards, digging ditches. The pay was terrible. The hours were long, and the work was backbreaking. But it was better than starving in Calabria. Vincenzo started at the very bottom as a bootblack, a shoe shiner. His first job was in Michael Hinky Dink Kenna's Working Man's Exchange, a noisy bar that served as both a social club and a political meeting place for the First Ward's Italian immigrant community. The Working Man's Exchange was more than just a place to drink. It was where political favors were given out, where jobs were found, where votes were delivered, and where young men learned how the real Chicago operated. Day after day, Vincenzo knelt on the floor of the bar, brushing and polishing the shoes of Kenna's customers. It was lowly work, but it put him near powerful people, and Vincenzo, who had changed his name to the English version, James, or Jim to his friends, was watching and learning. He saw how Kenna worked, how a clever man could turn illegal activity and politics into money. He saw how the system helped those who understood how to use it. More importantly, Kenna noticed him. The young Italian immigrant had something that made him different. He had charm, even with his limited English. Jim had a way of making people enjoy his company. He was friendly without being too eager to please. He worked hard without complaining. And he had a natural understanding of people that would help him greatly in the years ahead. Kenna, who was always searching for dependable men who could help him control the Italian vote, chose to assist young Jim Colosimo. He arranged for Jim to get a city government job as a street sweeper. It was not exciting work, pushing a broom through Chicago's dirty streets, but it was a step up from shining shoes, and more importantly, it was a connection to the political machine that controlled the city. Jim took to the job with energy. He did not just sweep streets. He organized the other Italian street sweepers. He understood that there was strength in large numbers, and that the men who controlled workers could control votes. He started a street cleaners social club, which was really an early form of a political group. Kenna rewarded his initiative by promoting him to street cleaning supervisor. Now Jim Colosimo was managing other men. He was learning how to organize, how to lead, how to make deals. He was building relationships throughout the Italian community. Every street sweeper he hired felt thankful to him. Every favor he did was kept in mind. He was creating a network, and that network was the base of real power in the First Ward. But street sweeping, even as a supervisor, was never going to make Jim Colosimo wealthy. He watched as other men, less hardworking, less intelligent, but more violent, became rich from running brothels, gambling houses and bars. He saw how the system worked. Pay the right people, and you could operate without punishment. Cross the wrong people, and you would be shut down or worse. Jim started adding to his income with small crimes. Nothing major at first. Stealing from drunk people in the levee, running small tricks, collecting protection money from street vendors. It was almost expected in the First Ward. An honest man stayed poor. A clever man who was not too worried about the law could get ahead. And Jim Colosimo desperately wanted to get ahead. The memory of poverty in Calabria haunted him. He had come to America to make something of himself, and he was ready to do whatever it took. In the late 1890s, Kenna promoted Jim to the job of precinct captain. This was a very important role in the political machine. Jim's task was simple: deliver the Italian vote on election day, make sure the right people won, and make sure they won by large amounts. In exchange, he received protection, money, and the unspoken permission to work in the illegal vice business. Jim Colosimo understood the job perfectly. He went door to door in the Italian community, making promises, doing favors, learning who needed jobs, who needed help with immigration papers, who needed legal assistance. On election day, he made sure every Italian man in his area voted, and voted the way Kenna and Coughlin wanted. Some voted many times. Some had been dead for years. It did not matter. Jim delivered the numbers. He also opened a pool hall, which quickly became a meeting place for Italian criminals. It was here that Jim made his first real connections to the underworld. He met people who cracked safes, burglars, con artists, and strong-arm men. He learned their trades, their methods, their networks. He was putting himself in the perfect position for what would happen next. By the turn of the century, Jim Colosimo was known throughout the First Ward. He was not rich yet, but he had important connections. He had the protection of the city's most powerful aldermen. He understood how to organize men and get results. He had left behind his immigrant poverty without losing his immigrant drive. He was prepared for the chance that would change him from a street-level political worker into one of the most powerful crime bosses in America. All he needed was the right partner, and in 1902 he found her. The woman who would change Jim Colosimo's life was named Victoria Morisco, and she was already a success when they met, 6 years older than Jim. Victoria was what polite society called a madam. She ran 2 brothels on the edge of the Levee district. They were working-class places where lonely men could find a woman's company for $1. Victoria was not beautiful in the usual way, but she had something more valuable: business sense. She knew how to manage women, how to make customers come back, how to stay out of trouble with the police, and most importantly, how to make money. Her brothels were clean, relatively safe, and profitable. In a business known for violence and mistreatment, Victoria ran a tight operation. When Jim Colosimo met Victoria Morisco in 1902, it must have seemed like destiny. She needed a man with political connections and organizational ability. He needed money and a way into the vice trade. They completed each other perfectly. The exact details of how they met are lost to history. Did they meet at one of the First Ward's many social events? Did Jim's work as a precinct captain bring him to her door? Did mutual friends introduce them, seeing that these 2 ambitious people might be perfect partners? We do not know. What we do know is that their partnership would be both romantic and practical, personal and profitable, and it would create the base for an empire. Jim and Victoria got married in 1902. For Jim, now 24 years old, it was a marriage that made perfect sense on every level. Victoria brought existing businesses, knowledge of the vice trade, and connections to other operators. Jim brought political protection, the ability to grow, and the ambition to create something much larger than a couple of $1 brothels. Their first joint business was a brothel that Jim insisted on naming the Victoria, after his new wife, located at Archer and Armour Avenue. It was a step up from Victoria's earlier places. It was cleaner, more upscale, with better-looking women and higher prices. The protection that Jim's political connections gave them meant they did not have to worry about police raids. The money started flowing in right away. Encouraged by their first success, Jim and Victoria opened a second place, the Saratoga, at Dearborn and 22nd Street. This one was even more fancy, serving businessmen and politicians instead of laborers and sailors. The decorations were rich, the women more attractive and better taught. The prices were higher, as you would expect. The Saratoga became known as one of the top brothels in the Levee. But Jim Colosimo's goals did not stop at 2 brothels. He understood something that many other vice operators did not. The real money came from having many places. Running 1 or 2 brothels would make you comfortable. Running dozens would make you rich. Running hundreds would make you a king. Over the next several years, Jim grew his business aggressively. He opened brothel after brothel, some high class, some low class. Covering every part of the market, he brought other operators under his protection. taking a share of their profits in exchange for making sure the police left them alone. He brought women from around the country, promising them a better life in Chicago. Some came willingly, attracted by the promise of good money. Others were forced, tricked, or simply had no other choices. By 1909, Jim Colosimo controlled nearly 200 brothels across Chicago. Think about that number for a moment. 200 places where sex was sold, each one making profit every single night. His organization employed thousands of women, dozens of managers, and many enforcers. It was a business empire built on illegal activity, operating openly with a complete knowledge of the city's political leaders. Jim's monthly income reached $50,000, which is about $8 to $9 million per year in today's money. For a man who had arrived in America as a poor immigrant less than 15 years earlier, it was an incredibly large amount of money, and Jim made sure everyone knew it. This was when Jim Colosimo became known as Diamond Jim. He created a style that was impossible to miss. He liked white suits, made to measure from the finest cloth. He wore diamond stick pins in his ties, so large they caught the light from across a room. He wore diamond rings on many fingers, sometimes as many as 6 or 7 at once. He wore diamond cufflinks, a diamond belt buckle, even diamond buttons on his clothes. When he walked down the street, he sparkled like a jewelry store window. The diamonds were not just for showing off, though they certainly were for that. They were also a kind of wealth he could carry easily, simple to take and hide if needed. And they were valuable everywhere in the criminal world, where bank accounts could be frozen and property taken away. Diamonds were as good as cash, maybe even better, because they never lost value and were impossible to trace. Jim's love of diamonds was matched only by his love of women. Even though he was married to Victoria, Jim was well known for having affairs. He had mistresses spread across the city. He would see a pretty woman singing in a cabaret or serving drinks in a bar, and he would give her many gifts, jewelry, attention. Some became his partners for a long time. Others were short adventures. Victoria, practical as always, seemed to accept this as the price of being married to a man like Jim. She was more interested in the business than in whether he was faithful. But the business was growing in ways that would need more than just Jim's political connections and Victoria's work knowledge. The vice trade was becoming more and more organized, with clear levels and more complex methods. Other ethnic groups, Irish, Polish, Jewish, were also joining the business. Competition was fierce and sometimes violent. Jim understood that to remain on top, he needed to do new things. He could not just be the biggest vice operator. He needed to be the most powerful, the most feared, the most untouchable. He started creating a gang with many different ethnic groups, which was unusual for that time. While most Chicago gangs were strictly divided by ethnicity, Jim brought together Italian, Irish, Polish, and Jewish criminals. He understood that variety could be a benefit, that different ethnic groups controlled different neighborhoods and had different connections. He created a structure with clear levels of command. At the top was Jim himself, making the big choices and keeping the crucial political connections. Below him were lieutenants who managed different parts of the operation: brothels, gambling, forcing people to pay, enforcement. Below them were managers, collectors, enforcers, and all the women who actually brought in the money. It was, in truth, the model that organized crime would use for the next 100 years. Jim Colosimo was creating modern organized crime, making a system that was more like a business than a street gang, more like a corporation than a group of criminals. But with success came danger. The more money Jim made, the more he became a target people wanted to hit. And in the Chicago underworld of the early 1900s, there was one threat that scared even the strongest men, the Black Hand. By 1909, Jim Colosimo had achieved everything he had dreamed of when he left Calabria 18 years earlier. He was wealthy beyond imagination, powerful throughout the First Ward, respected by politicians and feared by rivals. He had a wife who was his business partner, many mistresses who loved him, and a fortune that grew larger every month. But he also had a problem, a terrifying problem. A problem that money and political connections could not fix. The Black Hand had found him. The Black Hand, La Mano Nera in Italian, was not a single organization. It was a way of forcing people to pay that had been brought to America by Italian immigrants from Sicily and southern Italy. Where such methods had been used for centuries, the method was simple but effective. Find a successful Italian businessman or shop owner, send him a letter demanding money, threaten terrible results if he refused, and then collect the money. The letters often had the drawing of a black hand on them, which gave the scheme its name. What made the Black Hand so scary was not just the threats. It was their willingness to actually do what they threatened. Men who refused to pay found their businesses burned down, their children kidnapped, or themselves shot in the street. The Black Hand operators were violent, often new immigrants with no connections to the community and no fear of consequences. They would kill without a second thought. For Chicago's successful Italian Americans, the Black Hand was a nightmare. Many had worked for years to build honest businesses, only to have Black Hand extortionists take away their earnings. Some paid again and again, giving money month after month. Others refused to pay and paid an even higher price. The police were often not helpful. They saw the Black Hand as an Italian problem that Italians should solve themselves. In 1909, Jim Colosimo got his first Black Hand letter. We do not know the exact words, but these letters followed a pattern. They usually started with fake praise, acknowledging the person's success and hard work. Then came the demand, a certain amount of money to be delivered at a certain place by a certain date. Finally came the threats. If the money was not paid, terrible things would happen. Bombs would be planted, buildings would burn, children would be hurt, the person himself would be killed. The first letter demanded $50,000, an enormous amount, equal to a full month of Jim's income from his brothel empire. It was basically a demand that he hand over his entire operation to the extortionists. Jim, who had faced down political rivals and criminal competitors without fear, must have been shaken. The Black Hand was different. These were not men who could be bought off with political favors or scared with strong-armed men. They worked in the shadows, attacking without warning. You could not fight what you could not see. At first, Jim tried to handle it himself. He paid the money, hoping that would be the end of it. Of course, it was not. Paying the Black Hand was like feeding a stray dog. It just kept coming back for more. A second letter arrived, then a third. The demands continued. On at least one occasion, Black Hand operators supposedly confronted Jim with a gun, making it clear they were ready to kill him if he did not cooperate. Jim was trapped. If he kept paying, he would be drained of all his money. If he stopped paying, he would likely be killed. The police could not help him, or would not. His political connections were useless against men who did not care about politics. He needed something else. He needed protection of a different kind. He needed real muscle. Muscle from Brooklyn. He needed Johnny Torrio. Giovanni Johnny Torrio was born in southern Italy in 1882. 4 years after Jim Colosimo. Like Jim, He had come to America as a child, arriving in New York City with his widowed mother. Like Jim, he had started at the bottom, running errands and doing odd jobs to help his family survive. Unlike Jim, he had been attracted to crime early and completely, showing a talent for violence and organization that made him different from other street criminals. By his late teens, Torrio had become a member of the famous 5 Points Gang, one of New York's most powerful criminal organizations. The 5 Points Gang controlled much of Manhattan's Lower East Side, running prostitution, gambling, protection schemes, and political corruption plots. The gang's leader, Paolo Vaccarelli, who called himself Paul Kelly to sound less Italian, became Torrio's teacher. From Kelly, Torrio learned lessons that would help him for the rest of his life. He learned that how you looked mattered, that dressing well and speaking correctly gave you benefits that looking like a street thug never would. He learned that organization and planning are more valuable than just using force. He learned that violence should be used on purpose, not without thinking. He learned that the real money came from controlling vice, not from robbery or theft. And he learned that political connections were the key to long-term success. Torrio earned the nickname the Fox because of his cleverness. He was short, stocky, and did not look impressive. But his mind was very sharp. He could see several moves ahead in any situation. He was patient when patience was needed, and violent when violence was required. He did not drink too much, did not use drugs, did not chase women. He stayed focused on business in a way that was rare among criminals of that time. By 1909, Torrio had risen to become an important person in Brooklyn's underworld. He had moved beyond the 5 Points Gang to form his own operations. He owned several brothels, ran protection schemes, and had built a network of connections throughout New York's Italian community. He had also formed a partnership with a young criminal named Francesco Ialli, better known as Frankie Yale. Together, they owned the Harvard Inn, a bar in Coney Island that served as both an honest business and a cover for their criminal activities. One of the people Torrio employed at the Harvard Inn was a scarred young tough named Alphonse Capone. All to his friends, Capone had gotten his famous facial scars in a fight at the Harvard Inn, when he had said something rude to the sister of another customer. Even though he was young and had a tendency toward violence, Capone showed promise. Torrio took him under his protection, seeing in him a useful enforcer who could be shaped into something more. Life in Brooklyn was profitable for Torrio, but it was also dangerous. New York's gang wars were constant and bloody. Rival groups fought over territory, over insults, over women. Men were killed regularly. Torrio, for all his cleverness, was tired of the constant violence. He had bigger goals than just running a few brothels in Brooklyn. So when his cousin Victoria Moresco called from Chicago in 1909, explaining that her husband was being terrorized by Black-Hand extortionists and desperately needed help, Torrio saw an opportunity. Chicago was a wide-open city full of vice and corruption, but without the established organizations that dominated New York. In Chicago, a smart man might build something truly significant. Torrio sold his share of the Harvard Inn to Frankie Yale, who would keep it running and keep an eye on Al Capone. He packed his bags, said goodbye to New York, and got on a train to Chicago. He moved into Jim and Victoria's brownstone house in the First Ward. When Jim Colosimo first met Johnny Torrio, he must have been unimpressed. Torrio was short, barely 5'4" tall. He was stocky with a round face and thinning hair. He dressed well, but not flashily. He spoke quietly, almost gently. He did not look like a killer. He did not look like a man who could solve Jim's Black Hand problem. But Torrio assured Jim that he had everything under control, and indeed he did. Torrio had a lot of experience with Black Hand-style extortion. He had run such schemes himself back in Brooklyn. He knew how these operators thought, how they planned, what made them feel safe, and what made them vulnerable. Torrio's plan was simple and deadly. He told the Black Hand extortionists that Jim was ready to pay the money they demanded. He arranged a meeting, promising that Jim would deliver the money in person. The extortionists, their greed overcoming their caution, agreed. On the chosen night, Torrio drove a horse-drawn carriage to the meeting place. Inside the carriage, hidden from sight, were two of Colosimo's most trusted gunmen. When the three Black Hand operators came close, sure that they were about to collect a fortune, Torrio gave the signal. The gunmen came out of the carriage and started shooting. All three extortionists were killed. Their bodies were left in the street as a warning to anyone else who might think about targeting Big Jim Colosimo. The Black Hand threat was over. Jim was amazed. The problem that had bothered him for months, that had filled him with fear and cost him a lot of money, had been solved in one night of violence. Torrio had done what no one else could do. He had faced the Black Hand and won. Jim immediately made Torrio his second in command. It was a choice that would change Chicago's underworld forever. The partnership of Colosimo and Torrio would prove to be one of the most successful in criminal history, but also one of the most deadly. The partnership between Jim Colosimo and Johnny Torrio was a study in how different skills could work together. Jim was the public face of the organization. He was charming, generous, and loved in the Italian community. He was connected to the city's political leaders. Torrio was the planner. He was quiet, calculating, invisible to the public, but present in every part of the organization's operations. Jim loved being in the spotlight. He loved walking down the street in his white suits and diamonds, greeting people, shaking hands, being recognized and respected. He loved throwing parties, going to the opera, being seen at the best restaurants and clubs. He was a street kid from Calabria who had become a king in Chicago, and he wanted everyone to know it. Torrio preferred the shadows. He avoided having his picture taken. He rarely gave his name to newspapers and conducted business in private. He understood that the less visible you were, the harder you were to catch and convict. While Jim built his legend, Torrio built the structure that would make that legend profitable beyond imagination. Together, they made their power stronger across the First Ward and beyond. They brought smaller brothel operators under their control, offering protection from both the Black Hand and police trouble in exchange for a share of their profits. They grew into gambling, opening casinos and poker rooms throughout the city. They moved into controlling labor unions, using their connections to take over certain unions. They forced honest businesses to pay for protection. Whether they wanted it or not, the money poured in. Jim's monthly income, already large, now regularly went above $50,000. Torrio took his share and invested it carefully, buying properties, starting honest businesses as covers, and building a money empire that would last longer than any single criminal operation. In 1919, Jim and Torrio made a choice that would fix Jim's place in Chicago history. They opened Colosimo's Cafe, located at 2126 South Wabash Avenue. Colosimo's Cafe was Jim's greatest work, his monument to himself, his gift to the city that had given him everything. It was not just a restaurant. It was a palace, a symbol, a statement that an Italian immigrant could not just succeed in America, but could create something truly wonderful. The cafe's inside was made to amaze people. The doorknobs were covered with gold. The walls were covered in green velvet. The ceiling had a detailed painting showing cherubs and angels playing in clouds. Crystal chandeliers hung from above. Mirrors on the walls made the space seem even larger. The dining room could seat hundreds of people. There was a cabaret where performers entertained every night. There was a private dining room for special guests. Jim spent whatever was needed on the food and drink. The menu had the best steaks, the freshest seafood, and special Italian foods brought from Italy. The wine cellar was famous. The service was perfect. Prices were high, but not too high. Jim wanted Colosimo's Cafe to be available not just to the rich, but to anyone who wanted to have a special experience. From the day it opened, Colosimo's Cafe was a huge success. Chicago had never seen anything quite like it. In a city full of rough bars and immigrant restaurants, here was a place that could compete with anything in New York or San Francisco. Politicians came to eat there. Businessmen held meetings in the private rooms. Opera stars performed in the cabaret. Famous people passing through Chicago made sure to stop at Colosimo's. But the cafe's real genius was how it served as a connection between the criminal world and regular society. In the dining room, dishonest aldermen sat at tables next to respectable businessmen. Gangsters in expensive suits drank champagne alongside opera singers. The city's police chief might be seen laughing with known criminals. Colosimo's Cafe was neutral ground, a place where the lines between legal and illegal, respectable and disreputable, became unclear until they almost disappeared. For Jim, the cafe was more than just another business. It was proof of his success. He had started as a bootblack, polishing other men's shoes. Now those same men came to his restaurant, paid his prices, asked for his favor. He had achieved something that went beyond just having money. He had achieved respect, or something close enough to it that the difference did not matter. The cafe also became Jim's second home. He was there almost every day, greeting guests personally, making sure everything ran smoothly, enjoying the attention and admiration. When important guests arrived, Jim would often sit with them, telling them stories, ordering bottles of expensive wine, paying for their meals. He was generous to a fault, believing that showing off his wealth was as important as gathering it, while Jim played the friendly host. Torrio ran the operations behind the scenes. He managed the brothels, made sure the payments to police and politicians were delivered on time, dealt with problems before they became crises, and constantly looked for new chances to expand. The partnership worked because each man understood and respected the other's role. In 1919, Torrio made another smart choice that would have huge results. He opened a new place called the Four Deuces at 2222 South Wabash Avenue, just a few blocks from Colosimo's Cafe. The Four Deuces was everything the cafe was not. While Colosimo's Cafe was respectable and fancy, the Four Deuces was rough and unashamed in its illegal activities. The ground floor had a bar. The second floor was a gambling casino. The third and fourth floors had rooms where prostitutes entertained customers. The Four Deuces needed a manager, someone tough enough to handle the rough customers, smart enough to run the operations, and loyal enough to be trusted. Torrio knew just the man. He made a phone call to Brooklyn, to his old student at the Harvard Inn. A few weeks later, Alphonse Capone stepped off the train at Chicago's Union Station. He was 20 years old, already married with a young son, and eager for the chance Torrio had offered him. Capone had gotten into some trouble in Brooklyn, a fight that had brought police attention, and Torrio's offer of a fresh start in Chicago came at the perfect time. Torrio put Capone to work at the Four Deuces as a bartender and bouncer. It was a low-level job for someone who would become America's most famous gangster. But Capone approached it with his usual energy. He was good with customers, quick to stop potential violence, but willing to use force when necessary. He learned the business from the bottom up, just as Torrio had planned. Jim Colosimo barely noticed the young man from Brooklyn. Capone was just another worker, one of hundreds in the organization. Jim had no idea that this scarred kid mixing drinks and throwing out drunks would one day become the most powerful crime boss in America, or that Capone would play a part, however indirect, in Jim's own death. By 1919, the Colosimo Torrio organization was at its highest point. They controlled vice across Chicago's South Side and were expanding into other areas. Their political connections were solid. Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin made sure that the political machine protected them. Police raids on their places were announced ahead of time, allowing them to hide anything that could be used as evidence. When raids did happen, the charges were always dropped. Judges, prosecutors, aldermen, all were being paid. Jim Colosimo had become one of the most powerful men in Chicago. He walked the streets without bodyguards, sure that his political protection made him untouchable. He was invited to political rallies, charity events, opera performances. His opinion was asked about matters ranging from city politics to labor disputes. For an Italian immigrant in a time when Italians were widely treated badly, his position was amazing. But Jim was also getting comfortable. Too comfortable, Torrio thought. The empire they had built needed constant attention, constant new ideas, constant watchfulness. Jim seemed more interested in enjoying his success than in growing it. He spent more and more time at the cafe, less time on the street. He threw big parties, took expensive vacations, did whatever he wanted. Torrio started to worry. In the underworld, standing still was the same as moving backward. Other organizations were getting stronger. New illegal businesses were appearing. The world was changing. And Jim Colosimo seemed happy to ignore it all. Then in 1919, two things happened that would start the events leading to Big Jim Colosimo's death. First, the 18th Amendment was approved, setting the stage for Prohibition. Starting January 17, 1920, making, selling, and transporting alcoholic drinks would be illegal everywhere in the United States to most Americans. This seemed like a noble experiment in improving society. To Johnny Torrio, it looked like the greatest business chance in American history. Second, Jim Colosimo fell in love. Johnny Torrio saw Prohibition coming long before it arrived. The movement to ban alcohol had been getting stronger for decades, and by 1919, it was clear that a change to the Constitution banning alcohol was going to happen. When the 18th Amendment was approved on January 16, 1919, Torrio immediately understood what this meant. It meant opportunity, enormous, never-before-seen opportunity. Think about it from Torrio's point of view. Alcohol was one of the most used products in America. Working men drank beer after their shifts. The middle class enjoyed wine with dinner. The wealthy savored expensive whiskey and imported champagne. Drinking was part of the everyday life of American society. Millions of Americans drank alcohol regularly, and they were not going to stop just because the government said it was illegal. What Prohibition meant was that a product with huge, steady demand was about to be made illegal. And when something with huge demand becomes illegal, whoever provides it stands to make an enormous amount of money. Torrio understood that the structure for large-scale illegal alcohol sales already existed. The same methods they used to protect brothels and gambling operations could be used for secret bars and illegal breweries. The same politicians they already had on their payroll could be paid to ignore the alcohol trade. The same police officers who ignored their current operations could be bribed to ignore bootlegging, better yet the Volstead Act. The law that would enforce prohibition had a big weakness. Federal prohibition agents would be chosen by politicians, and they would be paid poorly. In other words, they would be easy to bribe. Local police, already used to taking bribes from vice operators, would simply add bootleggers to their list of protected criminals. Torrio started planning right away. He contacted people in Canada and Mexico, where alcohol was still legal, about supplying whiskey and other drinks. He found places for illegal breweries. He thought about creating networks of speakeasies, secret bars where people could drink against the law. He figured out possible profits and realized they would be much larger than everything the organization currently made from prostitution and gambling combined. One study estimated that by the mid-1920s, the Chicago outfit would be making $60 million per year from bootlegging alone, which is about $900 million in today's money. Prostitution had made them rich. Prohibition would make them legendary. But there was a problem, a big problem. A problem that wore white suits and diamond rings. Jim Colosimo wanted nothing to do with bootlegging. When Torrio showed his bootlegging plans to Jim, explaining the opportunities and profits with his usual carefulness, he expected excitement. What he got instead was a lack of interest. "I'm happy with what we have," Jim told him. Torrio was shocked. Happy with what they had? They had a chance to grow their operation 10 times larger, to take over an entirely new industry, to make more money than they had ever dreamed possible. And Jim was happy with what they had. Torrio tried to explain it differently. He showed Jim the numbers, the plans, the fact that other criminal organizations would certainly move into bootlegging. And if Colosimo did not, they would lose their top position in Chicago. Other gangs, Irish, Jewish, Polish, were already getting ready to take advantage of Prohibition. The North Side Gang, led by Dion O'Banion, was preparing to move hard into bootlegging if Colosimo stayed out of it. They would lose ground, but Jim would not change his mind. He had built his empire on prostitution and gambling, and those businesses were doing just fine. Bootlegging sounded complicated and risky. It would mean dealing with the federal government, not just local police. It would require spending a lot of money on buildings and equipment. It would need constant watchfulness against hijackers and rival gangs. Jim was in his early 40s now, wealthy beyond imagination, comfortable in his position. He did not want difficulties. "You handle it if you want," Jim told Torrio. "I don't want anything to do with it." For Torrio, this was not acceptable. He could not build a bootlegging empire as Jim's helper. He needed complete control, complete authority, the ability to make choices without asking for permission. More importantly, he knew that other members of the organization, younger, hungrier men like Al Capone, were eager to get into bootlegging. If Jim stood in their way, they would become angry and restless. Torrio started to see Jim Colosimo not as a boss or a partner, but as a blockage that, like the Black Hand extortionists a decade earlier, might need to be removed. Torrio was patient. He did not act without thinking. He watched and waited, looking for the right moment, the right reason, and then Jim gave him one. Jim fell in love. Her name was Dale Winter, and she was 19 years old, young enough to be Jim Colosimo's daughter. She had a beautiful voice, trained in church choirs, and dreams of becoming an opera singer. She was performing at Colosimo's cafe when Jim first saw her, singing for the dinner crowd in the cabaret. Jim was attracted immediately. Yes, he had always loved women, had always kept mistresses, had always been unfaithful to Victoria. But this was different. This was not just physical desire or an easy relationship. This was something deeper. Jim believed he had found true love. Dale was everything Victoria was not. Victoria was practical, businesslike, 6 years older than Jim, and by 1919 was in her late 40s. She had been a perfect partner for building an empire. But she was not romantic. She did not touch Jim's heart. Dale, on the other hand, was young, beautiful, talented, and seemed honestly impressed by Jim's success and generosity. Jim started spending time with Dale with an intensity that surprised even those who knew him well. He gave her many gifts, jewelry, furs, expensive dresses. He paid for her to take voice lessons from the best teachers in Chicago, telling her he would make her an opera star. He spent hours listening to her sing, going to every performance, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. For Dale's part, she seemed honestly fond of Jim. Yes, he was old enough to be her father. Yes, he was a gangster. Yes, he was married. But he was also kind to her, generous beyond measure, and offered her a life of comfort and opportunity that a working-class girl from Chicago could never have imagined. Whether she loved him or loved what he could give her is a question only she could have answered, and she never did publicly. Victoria Moresco watched her husband's new romance with a mix of acceptance and calculation. She had always known Jim was unfaithful, but his earlier affairs had been short. This was different. Jim was talking about marriage. He wanted to divorce Victoria and marry Dale for Victoria. This was both a personal insult and a financial worry. She had helped build the empire. She had been there from the start. Now Jim wanted to push her aside for a teenage girl, but Victoria was practical. If Jim wanted a divorce, she would give him one, but she would make sure she was paid properly for it. In March 1920, Jim Colosimo got a divorce from Victoria Moresco without any argument from her. The terms were generous. Victoria got property, money, and a guaranteed income. She would be financially secure for the rest of her life. In exchange, she agreed not to fight the divorce and to stay out of Jim's life. Jim was overjoyed. He was free to marry Dale. On April 17, 1920, less than a month after his divorce was final, Jim and Dale ran away together to West Baden Springs, Indiana. They were married in a quiet ceremony, far from the watching eyes of Chicago's newspapers and gossips. For the next 3 weeks, Jim and Dale were on their honeymoon. They stayed at fancy resorts, ate at expensive restaurants, saw shows and concerts. Jim was, by all accounts, happier than he had ever been in his life. He talked about the future, about making Dale an opera star, about maybe even retiring from the vice business, about living a quieter, more respectable life. His associates were shocked. To the men who worked for Jim Colosimo, their boss's behavior was alarming. Here was a man who had built his empire through violence and watchfulness. Suddenly acting like a lovesick teenager, he was distracted, unfocused, spending more time with his new young wife than on business. He was talking about retiring, about becoming honest, about leaving this life. This was exactly the wrong time for such thoughts. Prohibition had just begun in January 1920. The bootlegging wars were starting. Rival gangs were establishing their territories. Every day the Colosimo organization delayed getting into the liquor business was a day that competitors gained ground. The Chicago outfit needed a strong leader who was focused on growth and willing to be violent. Instead, they had a 42-year-old man who was acting like he was already retired. Johnny Torrio watched all this with cold calculation. He had spent a decade building alongside Jim, organizing the operations, planning growth, handling the details that Jim found boring. He had accepted Jim's authority, even when he disagreed with Jim's choices. But now Jim was not just standing still. He was actively holding the organization back. Torrio started having quiet conversations with other important members of the organization. Not openly plotting, Torrio was too smart for that. But testing the feelings, seeing how others felt about Jim's recent behavior. What he found was that he was not alone in his worries. Many of the younger gangsters, especially those eager to get into bootlegging, saw Jim as a problem from an earlier time. Al Capone, now Torrio's trusted assistant, was especially frustrated. Capone could see the money being left on the table while Jim was on his honeymoon and playing the devoted husband. Capone wanted to move hard into bootlegging, to establish the Chicago outfit as the top force before the North Side gang or other rivals took control of the market. The old man's lost his nerve, Capone reportedly said. He's thinking with his dick instead of his head. Torrio did not disagree. But he knew that simply complaining did nothing. If Jim Colosimo was the problem, then Jim Colosimo needed to be removed. But how? Jim still had great loyalty among many gangsters, particularly the older Italian members. He still had his political connections. Simply killing him would cause chaos, possibly a war within the organization. No, if Jim was going to be removed, it needed to be done carefully. The situation needed to be just right. It needed to look like something other than what it really was. And Torrio needed someone from outside to do it. Someone who could not be connected to the organization. Someone who could disappear right afterward. Torrio thought of Brooklyn. He thought of his old partner, Frankie Yale. Yale was violent, professional, and had no connections to Chicago that police could find. Better yet, Yale owed Torrio favors from their days running the Harvard Inn together. Torrio made the phone call. The conversation between Johnny Torrio and Frankie Yale must have been carefully worded, done in a way that would not be clear if anyone was listening. But the message was understood. There was a job in Chicago. It paid well, and it needed to be done quickly. Frankie Yale agreed in mid-May 1920. He got on a train from New York to Chicago. He checked into a hotel under a false name. He met with Torrio privately, away from Colosimo's cafe and the Four Deuces, at a place where they would not be seen together. The plan was simple. Jim would be brought to Colosimo's cafe with a false reason. Yale would be waiting in the cloakroom. When Jim entered, Yale would shoot him. Then Yale would immediately leave Chicago, returning to New York before the body was even found. By the time police started investigating, Yale would be 800 miles away with an alibi. There were risks, of course. Someone might see Yale. The shot might not kill him. Jim might bring someone with him. But Torrio had thought through every possibility. The cafe would be closed that afternoon, so there would be very few witnesses. Jim always came alone when asked for business. And Yale was a professional who did not miss. The only question was when. Torrio needed to wait until Jim returned from his honeymoon. Until the cafe was back to normal operations. Until the timing was perfect. He needed Jim to feel safe, comfortable, not suspicious. On May 11th, 1920, 3 weeks after Jim's wedding to Dale Winter, Torrio decided the time had come. The morning of May 11th, 1920, began like any other for Jim Colosimo. He woke up in his new home on Chicago's South Side. Next to his young bride, Dale, she was sleeping peacefully. Her dark hair spread across the pillow. Jim looked at her and felt a happiness he had never known before. After years of violence and vice, of living in the shadows, and always watching over his shoulder. He had found happiness. He had no idea he had less than 8 hours to live. Dale woke up and they had breakfast together. Jim read the newspapers, the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Daily News. The headlines were full of news about Prohibition enforcement, about raids on speakeasies, about the growing fights between various gangs over bootlegging territory. Jim barely paid attention. Those problems belonged to someone else now. He had his cafe, his honest income, his beautiful wife. The rest of it could be Torrio's concern. Around mid-morning, the telephone rang. It was Torrio. "Jim, I need to see you at the cafe this afternoon," Torrio said. "Important business, 4:30. Jim agreed without hesitation. Of course, he would meet with Torrio. Despite his wish to step back from operations, Jim was still the boss. When Torrio said something was important, Jim listened. He spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon with Dale, taking his time, enjoying her company. Around 4 p.m., he dressed carefully. He chose one of his favorite white suits, made from the finest linen, custom-made to fit his stocky frame perfectly. He chose his jewelry carefully, which diamond pins for his tie, which rings for his fingers, which cufflinks, which belt buckle. By the time he was finished, he was covered in diamonds worth tens of thousands of dollars. He looked at himself in the mirror and smiled. He looked like a king. He looked like a man who had won at life. "I'll be back for dinner," he told Dale. Kissing her goodbye, "Be careful," she said. Though she had no specific reason for worry, it was just something wives said. Jim stepped out of his house into the spring afternoon. His Pierce Arrow automobile was waiting at the curb, shining black in the sunlight. The Pierce Arrow was the Rolls-Royce of American cars, a vehicle that cost as much as a small house. Jim settled into the leather seats and told his driver to take him to the cafe. The drive through Chicago's South Side took about 15 minutes. Jim looked out the window at the streets where he had once swept dirt and picked pockets. He had come so far, from a bootblack to one of the most powerful men in Chicago. The American dream, achieved through ambition and violence and, yes, crime, but achieved nonetheless. At 4:30 p.m., the Pierce Arrow pulled up to 2126 South Wabash Avenue. Jim stepped out of the car, his white suit brilliant in the afternoon sun, his diamonds catching and reflecting light like tiny stars. He walked to the front entrance of his cafe, his palace, his monument to himself. He had no idea that Frankie Yale was inside, waiting in the cloakroom with a .38 caliber revolver. Jim pushed open the heavy front door. The cafe was closed for the afternoon, as it usually was between lunch and the dinner service. The inside was dim and quiet, a contrast to the usual noise of customers and staff. The green velvet walls seemed to soak up what little light came through the windows. The cherubs on the ceiling watched silently from above. "Hello, Frank. What's doing?" Jim called out cheerfully to his bookkeeper, Frank Camilla, who was working in the back office. "Nothing, Mr. Colosimo," Camilla replied, not looking up from his books. Jim smiled. Nothing. Everything was normal. He walked past the main dining room toward his private office in the back. His expensive leather shoes clicked softly on the polished floor. He hummed softly to himself. Maybe a tune Dale had been singing. Maybe an opera aria he had heard recently. The porter, Joe Gabriella, saw him pass. "Mr. Colosimo's in the office," he mentioned to someone. Perhaps Camilla, though it was just routine information. The boss was in. Nothing unusual. Jim entered his office and sat down behind his desk. He checked his pocket watch. 4:32 p.m. Torrio should be arriving any minute. Jim wondered what was so important that it needed a face-to-face meeting. Probably something about the bootlegging operations Torrio was running. Jim did not pay much attention to those details anymore, but he tried to stay informed. He heard the front door open and close. That must be Torrio now, Jim thought. He stood up from his desk and walked out of his office, heading toward the front door that looked out toward the street to see if it was indeed Torrio arriving. Behind him, the cloakroom door opened silently. Frankie Yale had been waiting in the cloakroom for over an hour. It had been dark, cramped, and uncomfortable. But Yale was a professional. He had done this before, waited in silence for the right moment to kill. He knew how to be patient, how to stay calm, how to make sure the job was done right. He heard Colosimo enter the cafe. He heard the cheerful greeting to the bookkeeper. He heard the footsteps walking toward the back office. He waited, his hand on the .38 caliber revolver in his jacket pocket, his breathing slow and steady. Then he heard the office door open again, heard footsteps coming back toward the front of the cafe. This was the moment. Yale eased open the cloakroom door just a crack. Enough to see out, but not enough to be seen. He saw Colosimo walking toward the front door, his back to the cloakroom. The white suit made an excellent target. The diamonds caught the light. Colosimo was looking toward the street, probably watching for Torrio's arrival. Yale stepped out of the cloakroom. He moved quickly but quietly. Closing the distance, his hand came up, the revolver extending toward the back of Colosimo's head. Jim Colosimo, lost in thought, heard nothing. Yale aimed carefully. Behind the right ear, into the brain, instant death. He squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was enormously loud in the closed space of the cafe. Echoing off the walls and ceiling, the bullet entered exactly where Yale had aimed, behind Colosimo's right ear, tearing through his skull and into his brain. Big Jim Colosimo was dead before he hit the floor. His body collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. The white suit crumpled. The diamonds scattered across the floor. Blood began to pool around his head, dark red against the polished wood. Yale did not wait to admire his work. The moment Colosimo fell, Yale was moving. He put the revolver back in his pocket and walked quickly toward the back exit of the cafe. He had studied the layout carefully and knew exactly which way to go. By the time Frank Camilla came running from the back office to see what the noise was, Yale was gone. "Mr. Colosimo," Camilla shouted, seeing his boss's body on the floor. "Mr. Colosimo." But Jim Colosimo did not answer. He would never answer again. The man who had built Chicago's vice empire, who had brought Johnny Torrio and Al Capone to the city, who had created modern organized crime, was dead at 42 years old, killed by the organization he had created. It was 4:35 p.m., 5 minutes. That is how long Jim Colosimo had been inside his own cafe before he was murdered. The porter, Joe Gabriella, ran to call the police within minutes. Sirens were wailing as police cars raced toward 2126 South Wabash Avenue. But they were far too late. The killer was already blocks away, heading toward Union Station, where he would get on a train back to New York. Frank Camilla, kneeling beside his boss's body, noticed something odd. Despite the violence of the murder, despite the blood and chaos, none of Jim's jewelry had been taken. The diamond pins, the rings, the belt buckle, all still on the body. This had not been a robbery. This had been an execution. Detective Chief John J. Garrity was one of the first high-ranking officers to arrive at Colosimo's cafe. He had known Big Jim personally had attended parties at the cafe, had taken envelopes of cash from Colosimo's organization, had looked the other way when it mattered. Now he stood over Jim's body, looking down at the man who had been one of the most powerful figures in Chicago's underworld. Who found him? Garrity asked. I did, Frank Camilla said, his voice shaking. I heard the shot and came running. He was already down. I didn't see anyone else. Did Mr. Colosimo have any appointments this afternoon? Not that I know of. He just came by to check on things. He does that sometimes. The porter, Joe Gabriella, was questioned. He said that Colosimo had arrived alone around 4:30 p. He had seemed in good spirits, nothing unusual. No one else had entered through the front door. At least not that Gabriella had seen. But there were many entrances to the cafe. Someone could have entered earlier, when the cafe was still open for lunch, and hidden until the right moment. Or someone could have entered through the back. The cafe connected to several other buildings. A killer could have come and gone without ever being seen on the street. The coroner arrived and examined the body. Single gunshot wound entering behind the right ear, exiting through the left eye. Death would have been instant, fired at close range, possibly from as close as a few feet. The killer had been sure of himself, exact, professional. This wasn't a robbery, Garrity announced to the gathered officers. Nothing taken, this was a hit. But who had ordered it? And who had pulled the trigger? The news of Colosimo's murder spread through Chicago like wildfire. Within hours, newspapers were printing special editions with huge headlines. Big Jim Colosimo murdered. King of Vice laid low in his own cafe. Diamond Jim dead. Dale Winter, now Dale Colosimo, was told that her husband of 3 weeks had been killed. She collapsed, sobbing, unable to believe that the man she had married less than a month ago was gone. Police questioned her for a long time. Where had she been that afternoon? Did her husband have enemies? Had he seemed worried or afraid recently? Dale told them everything she knew, which was not much. Jim had seemed happy. He had not mentioned any threats. He had been looking forward to the future. He had left home that afternoon, saying he would be back for dinner. That was all she knew. Police also questioned Victoria Morisco, Jim's ex-wife. Had she held anger over the divorce? Had she hired someone to kill the man who had left her for a teenager? Victoria was cooperative, but firm. She had moved on with her life. She had received a generous settlement. She had no reason to want Jim dead. But the police had other suspects in mind. They knew about Johnny Torrio. They knew about the arguments within the organization over bootlegging. They knew that Jim had been against expanding into the liquor trade. They brought Torrio in for questioning. Torrio was the picture of cooperation and grief. He had lost his teacher, his partner, his cousin by marriage. He was devastated. Yes, he had called Jim that afternoon to arrange a meeting, but he had arrived late, around 5:00 p.m., and found the police already there. No, he had no idea who would want to harm Jim. Yes, Jim had enemies, but what successful businessman didn't? The police questioned him for hours, looking for things that did not match. Trying to break his story, Torrio was too smart. His answers were consistent. His alibi was solid. Several people had seen him elsewhere at 4:30 p. There was no evidence connecting him to the murder. The police also looked at Frankie Yale. They knew about Yale's relationship with Torrio. They knew that Yale had been seen in Chicago around the time of the murder. They brought him in for questioning, but Yale's alibi was even stronger. He had been in New York on the day of the murder, or so several witnesses claimed. His train tickets showed he had traveled to New York 3 days before the killing. The police had no evidence placing him at the scene. Al Capone was another suspect. Everyone knew Capone was Torrio's right-hand man, and Capone was certainly capable of murder. But Capone had not even been in Chicago on May 11th. He had been in New York, taking care of some business for Torrio. Many witnesses confirmed it. The investigation stalled. The police had theories, but no proof. They suspected Torrio had ordered the hit, and Yale had carried it out, but they could not prove it. Without witnesses, without physical evidence, without anyone willing to talk, the case went nowhere officially. The murder of Big Jim Colosimo remained unsolved. Unofficially, everyone in Chicago's underworld knew exactly what had happened and why. The old boss had been killed because he would not change with the times. The young leaders had taken over. A new era had begun. But before that new era could fully start, Chicago had to say goodbye to Diamond Jim. On May 15th, 1920, 4 days after his murder, Big Jim Colosimo received a funeral worthy of a king. It was one of the most elaborate send-offs Chicago had ever seen. A spectacle that would be talked about for years. The wake was held at Colosimo's home. Thousands of people filed through to pay their respects, though whether they came out of real affection, political duty, or simple curiosity was anyone's guess. The line stretched for blocks. Police had to be called in to manage the crowds. Jim's body lay in an ornate bronze casket that cost $10,000, which is about $150,000 in today's money. It was lined with white satin and surrounded by flowers. So many flowers, huge arrangements filled the room, spilling out into hallways and other rooms. The smell was overwhelming. Roses, lily, orchids, every expensive flower imaginable, sent by politicians, gangsters, businessmen, and admirers. Dale Winter sat in mourning, dressed in black, her face covered by a veil, supported by friends and family. She was a widow at 19, having been married for just 3 weeks. Victoria Maresco also attended, standing at a respectful distance, her face impossible to read. What she thought as she looked at the man she had built an empire with, the man who had left her for a teenage girl, the man who was now dead, we can only imagine. The funeral service was held at the First Presbyterian Church. Though this required some careful arrangements, Jim had been Catholic, but the Catholic Church refused to give him a Catholic burial, not because of his criminal businesses, not because of the prostitution or gambling or violence, but because he had divorced Victoria. The church could overlook murder and vice, but divorce was unacceptable. The unfairness was striking, but Jim's associates were not in a position to argue. The Presbyterian Church agreed to hold the service. The pallbearers were a list of who was who in Chicago's political and criminal worlds. There were 53 of them, an extraordinary number. They included 3 judges, 8 aldermen, an assistant state's attorney, a congressman, a state representative, and a leading singer from the Chicago Opera Company. Also among the pallbearers were gamblers, former gamblers, bar owners, and men whose main qualification was that they knew how to hurt people. It was perhaps the only funeral in American history where judges and hitmen carried the casket together. The service itself was surprisingly dignified. A Presbyterian minister gave a speech about Jim that carefully avoided mentioning exactly how Jim had made his money. He spoke of Jim's generosity, which was real enough. Jim had given generously to causes that helped Italian immigrants. He spoke of Jim's love of opera and culture. He spoke of Jim as a self-made man who had achieved the American dream. What he did not mention were the brothels, the gambling dens, the violence, or the fact that Jim's American dream had been built on the mistreatment of thousands of women. After the service, the funeral procession made its way through the streets of Chicago's South Side. The hearse was huge and fancy, pulled by horses covered in black cloth. Behind it came car after car carrying mourners, hundreds of vehicles stretching for blocks. The route of the procession had been planned carefully. It would pass by all of Jim's major achievements. First, it passed the Four Deuces on South Wabash, where the prostitutes and gamblers stood outside and watched in silence. Then it approached 2126 South Wabash Avenue, Colosimo's Cafe, the place of Jim's murder. Just 4 days earlier, the hearse stopped in front of the cafe. For a long moment, nothing happened. The horses stood still. The mourners waited. It was as if Jim was being given one last moment to look at the monument he had built, the place where he had ruled as king, the place where he had been murdered. Then the procession moved on, heading toward Oakwood Cemetery. At the cemetery, more than 5,000 people had gathered. The whole organization of the Democratic Party was there. Aldermen, ward bosses, precinct captains, the Street Laborers Union, which Jim had helped organize decades earlier, marched in formation carrying banners. Honest businessmen who had paid Jim for protection stood alongside gangsters who had enforced that protection. It was a cross-section of Chicago's power structure, all come to say goodbye to a man who had understood how the city really worked. The bronze casket was lowered into the ground. Dale Winter sobbed quietly. Vittoria Moresco watched with dry eyes. Johnny Torrio stood at the back of the crowd, his face carefully showing nothing, his mind already planning the future. As the mourners left, as the flowers were placed on the fresh grave, as Chicago began to forget Diamond Jim Colosimo, one thing became clear: an era had ended. The time of the flashy vice lord who walked the streets in white suits and diamonds was over. The time of the businesslike gangster, the organized criminal. The businessman of vice was beginning, and Johnny Torrio was ready to lead it. Outside Jim Colosimo's brownstone on the evening after the funeral, a car waited at the curb. Inside sat Hinky Dink Kenna, the alderman who had given Jim his first real job as a precinct captain all those years ago. Kenna had come to pay his respects privately, away from the public show of the funeral. Johnny Torrio came out of the brownstone and walked to Kenna's car. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. Then Torrio climbed into the back seat beside Kenna. They spoke quietly for several minutes. What they discussed, no one knows for certain, but we can guess. They were making deals about the future. Kenna needed to know that whoever took over Jim's empire would continue the political agreements that had made everyone rich. Torrio needed to make sure that he would receive the same protection Jim had enjoyed. When Torrio finally got out of the car and walked back into the brownstone, the crowd of mourners who had gathered on the street understood the change was complete. Johnny Torrio was now the boss of Chicago's Underworld. Torrio did not waste any time. Within days of the funeral, he was putting into action the bootlegging plans that Jim had refused to consider. He contacted his connections in Canada and built relationships with whiskey suppliers. He found places for illegal breweries throughout Chicago. He began changing regular bars into speakeasies, secret bars where people could drink against Prohibition. The setup was remarkably similar to what the organization had used for prostitution. Payments to police made sure that raids were announced ahead of time or avoided completely. Payments to politicians made sure that unfavorable laws were never passed or enforced. Payments to federal prohibition agents made sure that the few honest cops who tried to enforce the law found themselves transferred or pushed aside. Torrio also began splitting Chicago into territories. giving different ethnic gangs control of different areas. It was a smart plan that would become the model for organized crime across America. The Italians controlled the south side, the Irish controlled the north side, the Poles controlled the west side. Each group had its territory, its operations, its share. As long as everyone stayed in their own area, there was enough money for everyone. The profits were huge, within months. The Chicago outfit was making more from bootlegging than it had ever made from prostitution. Within a year, they were making millions. Torrio's vision had been correct. Prohibition was the greatest business chance in American history. But Torrio understood something that Jim Colosimo never had. That huge profits attracted huge competition. Other gangs saw the money being made and wanted their share. The North Side Gang, led by the flashy Diane O'Banion, especially bothered Torrio. O'Banion was Irish, charming, violent, and completely uninterested in respecting territorial borders. He raided outfit speakeasies, stole outfit liquor shipments, and generally acted like he owned Chicago. Torrio tried to negotiate. He tried to create clear borders and agreements. But O'Banion was not interested in agreements. He wanted to control Chicago, and he saw Torrio as weak, a small man who depended on others to fight his battles. O'Banion did not understand that Torrio's greatest weapon was not his size or his personal courage. It was his student. The young man from Brooklyn who had been working his way up through the organization since 1919. It was Al Capone. By 1920, Al Capone was no longer just the bartender at the Four Deuces. Torrio had seen Capone's intelligence and violence and had been preparing him for bigger things. Capone had a gift for violence. He could beat a man senseless without breaking a sweat, could order a murder without hesitation, but he also had business sense. He understood money, logistics, organization. He was everything Torrio needed in a second in command. After Jim's death, Torrio promoted Capone quickly. By 1922, Capone was basically Torrio's partner, managing day-to-day operations while Torrio handled strategy and political connections. By 1923, Capone was known throughout Chicago as someone you did not cross. By 1924, he was becoming famous, or infamous, across the country. The relationship between Torrio and Capone was similar to the relationship between Jim Colosimo and Torrio had been, except that Capone and Torrio agreed on everything that mattered. Both wanted to grow. Both understood that violence was sometimes needed. Both believed in organization and discipline. They were, for several years, the perfect criminal partnership. But the bootlegging wars were getting worse. The fight with O'Banion's North Side Gang became more violent. Small insults led to revenge attacks, which led to more revenge attacks, which led to murders. The streets of Chicago became a battlefield. In November 1924, Torrio decided that O'Banion had to be removed. He arranged for 3 gunmen to enter O'Banion's flower shop. O'Banion, oddly enough, ran a real flower business alongside his criminal activities. They shot him down. O'Banion died immediately. Shot 6 times at close range, but O'Banion's death did not end the war. It made it worse. O'Banion S. associates, Jaime Weiss, Bugs Moran, and others swore to get revenge. They blamed Torrio and Capone for O'Banion's murder, and they were right to do so. On January 24, 1925, Torrio was leaving his apartment building when 2 men approached with guns drawn. They opened fire. Torrio was hit many times in the jaw, chest, and stomach. He collapsed on the sidewalk. Bleeding heavily, surprisingly, he lived. The gunman had run away before finishing the job. and Torrio was rushed to the hospital. For weeks, he hung between life and death. When he finally recovered enough to speak, he made a choice that surprised everyone. "It's all yours, Al," he told Capone. "I'm done, Johnny Torrio, the Fox." The planner who had built the Chicago outfit into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America was quitting. He was only 43 years old. But he had had enough. He had spent 20 years in the criminal underworld, had survived countless threats and fights, and he had finally realized that no amount of money was worth dying for. He would serve a short prison sentence for a Prohibition violation, a sentence he had already been facing before the attempt on his life. And then he would move to Italy and live out his days in relative peace. He would sometimes talk with American gangsters, would sometimes serve as an experienced advisor to organized crime. But his days as an active crime boss were over. The Chicago outfit now belonged completely to Al Capone, and under Capone, it would reach heights of power and fame that even Jim Colosimo could not have imagined. From 1925 to 1931, Al Capone changed the Chicago outfit from a powerful local organization into arguably the most famous criminal operation in American history. His name became a symbol for gangsters, Prohibition, and the violence of the Roaring Twenties. Capone grew the bootlegging operations massively. He controlled hundreds of speakeasies throughout Chicago and its suburbs. He owned breweries that produced millions of gallons of beer every year. He brought in whiskey from Canada and rum from the Caribbean. At its highest point, the Chicago outfit was making an estimated $60 million per year, over $1 billion in today's money. But Capone was not satisfied with just bootlegging. He moved into every criminal activity imaginable. Gambling, of course, casinos, horse betting, numbers games, prostitution, the business that Jim Colosimo had started, labor racketeering, controlling unions and forcing businesses to pay. Even honest businesses. Capone owned restaurants, nightclubs, and more. The profits were invested wisely. Capone bought property throughout Chicago. He established himself in Cicero, a town just west of Chicago, where he basically controlled the local government. He owned politicians at every level, from beat cops to aldermen to judges. He threw huge parties attended by famous people, politicians, and high society. He gave money to charities and presented himself as a public benefactor. The violence, however, only got worse. The war with the North Side Gang continued throughout the late 1920s. Bombings, shootings, and murders became normal. Capone survived many attempts on his life. His enemies were not so lucky. The most famous event came on February 14, 1929, St. Valentine's Day. 7 members of the North Side Gang were tricked into coming to a garage on North Clark Street with the promise of a whiskey shipment. When they arrived, men dressed as police officers entered and lined them up against the wall as if doing a regular check. Then the officers pulled out Thompson submachine guns and opened fire. All 7 men were killed in a storm of bullets. It was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, one of the most brutal gangland killings in American history. And while it was never proven, everyone knew who had ordered it: Al Capone. The massacre shocked even Chicago's hardened residents. The violence had gone too far. Public opinion started turning against gangsters in general, and Capone in particular. Newspapers that had once shown him as a colorful character now called him a monster. People demanding change wanted action. The federal government decided to make an example of him. In 1931, after years of investigation, federal prosecutors finally found a way to bring down Al Capone: tax evasion. Even though he had a huge income, Capone had never filed a tax return. He had believed that the same political protection that kept him free from criminal charges would protect him from the IRS. He was wrong. The trial was a sensation. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney George E. Hugh Johnson, carefully recorded Capone's income and his failure to pay taxes. Capone's lawyers tried every trick they knew, but the evidence was too strong. On October 17, 1931, Al Capone was found guilty of 5 counts of income tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, first at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, then at the newly opened Alcatraz. By the time he was released in 1939, his health destroyed by syphilis. The Chicago outfit had moved on without him. He retired to his home in Florida, where he died in 1947 at the age of 48, his mind ruined by disease. The Chicago outfit continued after Capone, of course. It would remain a powerful force in organized crime for decades, run by a series of bosses. But it never again reached the same level of fame or cultural impact it had during Capone's time, and all of it the bootlegging empire. The violence, the corruption, the cultural impact, all of it traced back to a single choice made by Johnny Torrio in May 1920, the choice to remove Big Jim Colosimo. In the weeks following Jim Colosimo's death, Dale Winter faced a choice that would decide the rest of her life. She was Jim's legal widow, which meant she had certain rights to his money and property. Jim had died without making a will, which created a complicated legal situation. But by all accounts, Jim had been extremely wealthy when he died. His half-interest in Colosimo's cafe alone was making $50,000 per year in profit. There were properties, businesses, investments. Dale stood to receive a fortune, but Dale was smart enough to understand the reality of her situation. She was 19 years old, married to Jim for only 3 weeks before his murder. She had no connections to his organization, no protection from his former associates, no understanding of the criminal underworld, and she had something that might prove deadly. A legal claim to assets that the outfit wanted to control. Victoria Moresco had been Jim's business partner for nearly 20 years. She understood the vice trade, had connections throughout the organization, and was respected, or at least acknowledged, by the gangsters. Dale was an outsider, a pretty young singer who had happened to catch Jim's eye. If she tried to claim Jim's assets, she would be putting herself in direct conflict with people who solved problems with violence. Moreover, she had to consider who might have killed her husband. The police investigation had gone nowhere, but Dale was not stupid. She could understand the hidden meaning. Jim had been killed by someone in his own organization, probably because of arguments over business direction. The same people who had killed Jim would have no problem killing her if she became a problem. So Dale made a choice that undoubtedly saved her life. She walked away from everything. She announced that she did not want any of Jim's money or property. She would not fight over what happened to his possessions. She gave up her claim to the cafe, the brothels, the gambling operations. All of it, Jim's 2 brothers, whom he had not seen in years, and who suddenly appeared after his death, could split the assets among themselves. She wanted nothing. It was an extremely smart decision for a 19-year-old. Dale understood that there are things more valuable than money, and staying alive was one of them. She had learned an important lesson that many people never learn. You do not touch mafia money. You do not claim assets from a murdered gangster's estate. You walk away quietly and count yourself lucky to escape with your life. Dale left Chicago shortly after. She married again, this time to a man who was not a gangster. She adopted children and lived quietly. She occasionally acted in movies, during the 1930s and 1940s. Though never becoming a star, she kept her past mostly secret, rarely talking about her short marriage to Diamond Jim Colosimo. Val Winter lived until 1985, reaching the age of 92. She outlived not just Jim, but also Torrio, Capone, and most of the other gangsters from that time. She died peacefully of natural causes in her own bed, surrounded by family. It was a much better death than the one her first husband had received. Victoria Moresco did much better than Dale after Jim's death. She had arranged a generous divorce settlement, which Jim had paid before his death. She owned properties, had a good amount of savings, and kept connections to the criminal underworld through her years of work in the vice trade. Unlike Dale, Victoria was never suspected of being involved in Jim's murder, even though she was an ex-wife with possible reasons. The police and the organization understood that Victoria was too practical to have Jim killed. She had already gotten what she wanted, a fair financial settlement and freedom from a marriage that had long been without love. Why risk everything by ordering a murder? Victoria continued to work in Chicago's underworld for several more years. Though she slowly moved into more honest businesses, she invested in real estate, owned several apartment buildings, and became a respectable landlady. By the time she died in the 1940s, few people remembered that she had once been one of Chicago's most successful madams. History has mostly forgotten Victoria Moresco, remembering her only as Jim Colosimo's first wife. But in many ways, she was more remarkable than Jim. She had built her businesses in a time when women had few rights and even fewer opportunities. She had successfully moved through the male-dominated criminal underworld. She had survived being pushed aside for a younger woman, arranged a good settlement, and lived well for years afterward. Victoria was a survivor in the truest sense. And unlike Jim, she died of old age rather than violence. One of the most striking parts of Big Jim Colosimo's death was the Catholic Church's response, or rather their refusal to respond properly. Jim had been baptized Catholic in Italy. He had kept cultural connections to Catholicism throughout his life, attending services on major holidays and giving money to Catholic charities. He had been, by the standards of Chicago's criminal underworld, a fairly religious man. But when he died, the Catholic Church refused to give him a Catholic burial. They refused to let his body be placed in holy ground. They refused to perform a Catholic funeral service. The reason? Jim had divorced Victoria and remarried. In the eyes of the church, he had committed adultery and was living in sin with Dale Winter. This made him unable to receive Catholic burial rites. The deep unfairness of this decision was not lost on observers. The Catholic Church was willing to ignore Jim's career as a vice lord. They were willing to ignore the hundreds of brothels he had operated, the thousands of women whose bodies had been used for his profit. They were willing to ignore the violence, the corruption, the moral decay he had spread throughout Chicago. They were willing to ignore murder itself, but divorce, that was too much. That was unforgivable. So Big Jim Colosimo, who had harmed more lives than anyone could count, who had built an empire on human suffering, who had created modern organized crime in America, was denied Catholic burial, not for his crimes, but for remarrying after divorce. He was buried in Oakwood Cemetery, in ground that was not holy. His grave marker was simple, bearing just his name and dates. There was no Catholic blessing, no prayers for his soul, no recognition from the church he had supported. The irony was painful, but also somehow appropriate. Jim had lived his whole life on the edges of society, operating in the gray areas between legal and illegal, respectable, and disreputable. It was fitting, perhaps, that even in death he remained on the edge, buried in unholy ground, claimed by neither heaven nor hell. But somewhere in between, Big Jim Colosimo died in 1920. But his influence went far beyond his death. He had created a plan for organized crime that would be followed for the next 100 years. Consider what Jim had started: political corruption as a base. Jim understood that criminal businesses could not survive without political protection. He spent huge amounts of money bribing politicians, police, judges, and other officials. He made sure that every elected official in his area was either under his control or too scared to oppose him. This method of organized corruption would be used by criminal organizations across America, an organization with many ethnic groups, at a time when most gangs were strictly divided by ethnicity. Jim built an organization that included Italian, Irish, Polish, and Jewish gangsters. He understood that variety could be his strength, that different ethnic groups controlled different neighborhoods and had different political connections. The Chicago outfit would keep this mix of ethnicities throughout its history. A structure with clear levels. Jim created a business-like structure with clear chains of command. At the top was the boss. Below him were lieutenants managing different operations. Below them were managers, collectors, and enforcers. This structure made the organization more effective and stronger. If one person was arrested or killed, the organization kept operating, mixing honest and dishonest businesses. Jim understood that running some honest businesses alongside criminal activities provided both cover and extra income. Colosimo's Cafe was an honest restaurant. It also served as headquarters for an illegal empire. This mixing of honest and dishonest would become standard practice in organized crime. Violence as a business tool, not a personal fight. Jim used violence on purpose. He did not kill out of anger or for revenge. He killed when it made business sense. When the Black Hand extortionists threatened him, he had them removed efficiently. This cold, business-like approach to violence would mark organized crime throughout the 20th century. These ideas did not come completely from Jim. Other gangsters were creating similar methods at the same time in New York, Philadelphia, and other cities, but Jim put them into practice successfully in Chicago, creating a model that Johnny Torrio and Al Capone would expand into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. The Chicago outfit would remain a major force in organized crime for decades after Jim's death. In the 1930s and 1940s, it expanded into Hollywood, controlling unions and forcing movie studios to pay. In the 1950s and 1960s, it moved into Las Vegas, taking money from casinos. In the 1970s and 1980s, it continued to run gambling, loan sharking, and extortion schemes throughout Chicago and beyond. Federal prosecutions eventually weakened the outfit, as they did most American organized crime families. By the 2000s, it was a shadow of its former self. But for 80 years, from Jim's rise in the 1900s through the late 20th century, the organization he had helped create remained one of the most powerful criminal operations in America. In the language of organized crime, a Mustache Pete is an old-school gangster who refuses to change with the times. The word supposedly comes from the handlebar mustaches worn by Italian gangsters of the early 20th century. Mustache Petes believed in the old ways. They did not trust working with non-Italians. They were more interested in respect than profit. They resisted new ideas and new criminal businesses. By this definition, Big Jim Colosimo was one of the original Mustache Petes. Not literally, Jim was clean-shaven, preferring a more modern look, but in his thinking. When the greatest business chance in American history came along in the form of Prohibition, Jim said no. He was satisfied with his prostitution and gambling empire. He did not want complications. He did not want to change, and it got him killed. The conflict between Mustache Pete's and young leaders would repeat itself throughout mob history. In the 1930s, a new generation of Italian-American gangsters, including Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, removed or pushed aside the old-school bosses who wanted to keep organized crime strictly Italian and focused on old ways. The young leaders created the modern American Mafia with its commission system, its willingness to work with gangsters of any ethnicity, its focus on making as much money as possible. The same pattern played out in individual cities. Old bosses who could not change were replaced by younger, more aggressive successors. Sometimes the change was peaceful, as when Torrio retired and gave power to Capone. More often it was violent, as when Jim was murdered for refusing to accept bootlegging. The lesson was clear. In organized crime, as in honest business, the only thing that stays the same is change. Those who change survive and do well. Those who do not end up dead or forgotten. Jim Colosimo's tragedy was that he had achieved everything he wanted. He had gone from a poor immigrant to one of the most powerful men in Chicago. He had built an empire, made a fortune, achieved respect and recognition. He had even found love late in life. He was, by his own standards, completely successful. But success made him too confident. He stopped being hungry. He stopped being watchful. He forgot that in the criminal underworld, you can never rest, never stop changing, never believe you are safe. And that forgetfulness cost him his life. History does not offer second chances, but it is worth asking. What if Jim Colosimo had said yes to Johnny Torrio? What if he had accepted bootlegging enthusiastically instead of resisting it? Would he have lived? Possibly, if Jim had been an active partner in the bootlegging expansion. Torrio would have had no reason to remove him. Jim's political connections, his organizational skills, his public image, all would have been valuable assets in building a bootlegging empire. With Jim's approval and participation, the Chicago outfit might have moved into the Prohibition era smoothly, with Jim remaining as the public-facing boss. While Torrio and Capone handled the details, Jim might have lived to an old age, might have retired peacefully in the 1930s, might have died in his bed surrounded by family. His name might be remembered differently, not as a warning story about refusing to change, but as one of the builders of Prohibition-era organized crime. But there is another possibility. Jim might have been killed anyway. Just later, and for different reasons, the bootlegging wars were extremely violent. Gangsters were being murdered all the time throughout the 1920s. Even if Jim had accepted bootlegging, he might have been killed by the North Side Gang, or by federal agents, or in any number of violent events that marked that time. Or perhaps Jim's romance with Dale Winter would have caused his death regardless. His choice to divorce Victoria and marry a teenager half his age had upset many people in his organization. Some saw it as a betrayal of Victoria, who had been essential in building the empire. Others saw it as proof that Jim was losing his edge, thinking with his heart or other body parts instead of his head. Even if Jim had supported bootlegging, his personal life might have created enough anger that someone in the organization decided he needed to go. We cannot know for sure. What we do know is that Jim's refusal to accept bootlegging gave Torrio both the reason and the excuse to have him killed. Without that refusal, Jim's story might have ended very differently. The history of organized crime in Chicago can be understood through three men: Big Jim Colosimo, Johnny Torrio, and Al Capone, each built upon the work of the one before him. Each added his own new ideas, and together they created something that became larger than any of them alone. Jim Colosimo laid the foundation. He established the basic model: systematic political corruption, organization of vice operations, a structure with clear levels, mixing honest and dishonest businesses. He showed that an Italian immigrant could rise to tremendous power in America through ambition and violence. He proved that the system could be corrupted, that politicians would stay bought, that vice could be organized like any other business. Without Jim's groundwork, there would have been no empire for Torrio to inherit. Johnny Torrio was the builder. He took Jim's foundation and created something more complex. He grew beyond vice into bootlegging, changing a local operation into a national power. He brought modern business methods to organized crime, treating it like a corporation rather than a street gang. He understood strategy in a way Jim never had, planning years ahead, positioning the organization for maximum profit and minimum risk. He brought Al Capone to Chicago, seeing talent and potential in the young Brooklyn tough. Without Torrio's strategic brilliance, the Chicago outfit would have remained just another vice operation. Al Capone was the face. He took everything Jim and Torrio had built and made it so big that it became nationally, even internationally famous. Capone understood publicity in a way his predecessors had not. He created a public image, the smiling gangster, the modern-day Robin Hood, the businessman who simply gave the public what it wanted. He made the Chicago outfit the most famous criminal organization in America, made his own name a symbol for gangsters in the Roaring Twenties. Without Capone's personality and style, the Chicago outfit would have been powerful, but unknown. Each man needed the others. Jim provided the foundation, but lacked the vision for growth. Torrio provided the strategy, but lacked the personality to become a public figure. Capone provided the fame, but needed the structure that Jim and Torrio had built. Their relationships were complex. Jim probably saw Torrio as a useful helper, never realizing that Torrio was the better strategist. Torrio respected Jim, but eventually saw him as a blockage that needed to be removed. Torrio taught Capone, but was eventually surpassed by his student. Capone built upon Torrio's work, but went beyond him in ambition and violence. Together, these three men created the Chicago outfit. Separately, none of them might have achieved what they did. It was a partnership, however unwilling and temporary, that changed American criminal history. Big Jim Colosimo's life and death have interested Americans for over 100 years. He has appeared in books, movies, television shows, and music. His story has been told and retold, made more exciting and dramatic, until it is sometimes hard to separate fact from fiction. Perhaps the most well-known fictional version came in HBO's Boardwalk Empire from 2010 to 2014, where Jim appears as a character who appears a few times in the first 2 seasons. The show shows his relationship with Torrio and Capone, his resistance to bootlegging, and his murder. While the show changes the order of events and some details, it captures the basic truth of Jim's story. A powerful man brought down by his refusal to change. The 2016 AMC documentary series, The Making of the Mob, Chicago, also showed Jim prominently, spending significant time explaining how he built the foundation that Torrio and Capone would use. The musical Chicago, written in 1975 and brought back many times since, including a 2002 movie version, mentions Colosimo's Cafe as a famous place in the city's Vice District. While Jim himself does not appear in the musical, his cafe serves as a symbol for the corruption and glamour of 1920s Chicago. Musician Ian Hunter mentioned Jim in his song Resurrection Nary about a Chicago urban legend. The song mentions Diamond Jim's Casino, connecting Jim to Chicago's supernatural stories. Colosimo's cafe itself operated for 6 more years after Jim's death, finally closing in 1926 when it was shut down for breaking the Volstead Act. The building changed owners several times over the decades. For years, it held various businesses. Its glamorous past hidden under layers of neglect and changes. Today, the building still stands at 2126 South Wabash Avenue, though it is now occupied by modern businesses. A small historical marker notes its importance, but most people passing by have no idea. They are walking past the place where one of America's most important gangland murders took place. Jim's grave at Oakwood Cemetery is occasionally visited by true crime fans and history enthusiasts. The headstone is simple and gives no hint of the flashy man buried beneath it. No diamonds mark the grave. No white suit decorates the body under the soil. Just a name, a date, and silence. Big Jim Colosimo's life is the American dream in its darkest form. He came to America as a poor immigrant and achieved tremendous success through ambition, hard work, and intelligence. He rose from shining shoes to owning one of Chicago's most famous restaurants. He went from street sweeper to king of the underworld. By normal measures, he was extremely successful. But his success was built completely on exploitation and vice. His fortune came from selling women's bodies, from running illegal gambling operations, from corrupting politicians and police. The empire he built depended on human suffering. The American dream he achieved came at the cost of thousands of lives damaged by prostitution, addiction, and violence. This contradiction lies at the heart of Jim's story. We can admire his rise from poverty while being disgusted by his methods. We can recognize his organizational genius while condemning what he organized. We can understand his hunger for success while recognizing that his success destroyed lives. Jim represents a truth that America has always struggled with, that the line between honest and dishonest business is sometimes more unclear than we would like to admit. The politicians he bribed were elected officials. The police he paid off wore badges. The judges who dismissed charges against him worked in courtrooms. The system that allowed Jim to do well was the same system that was supposed to stop him. In a way, Jim succeeded not despite American institutions, but because of them. He understood that every system could be tricked. Every official could be bought. Every law could be avoided with enough money and the right connections. He was a criminal, yes, but he was a criminal who understood how America actually worked. Not how it claimed to work in school books, but how it really worked on the streets and in the back rooms. The irony is that Jim genuinely loved America. He was proud of being American, proud of what he had achieved, proud to live in a country where an immigrant from Calabria could become powerful and wealthy. He gave money to American charities, attended American political events, accepted American culture. He saw no problem between loving America and corrupting it. In his mind, he was playing the game by the actual rules rather than the pretend rules. This makes Jim a particularly American figure. Only in America could someone rise so far, so fast through such completely illegal means. Only in America could a bootblack become a millionaire in 15 years. Only in America could an immigrant from southern Italy sit down to dinner with congressmen and judges. The same openness and opportunity that made America great also made it open to people like Jim, who were willing to use those qualities without mercy. One of the most interesting parts of Jim Colosimo's story is how love destroyed him. Throughout his life, Jim had been violent in pursuing his goals. He had betrayed rivals, corrupted officials, used vulnerable women, and ordered murders. He had been willing to do whatever it took to build his empire. But when he fell in love with Dale Winter, something changed. For the first time in his adult life, Jim wanted something more than power and money. He wanted domestic happiness. He wanted to be a husband to a woman he loved. He wanted to help Dale achieve her dreams of becoming an opera singer. He wanted, in other words, a normal life, or as normal life as a vice lord could have. This desire for normality was his downfall. The same qualities that made him successful in the criminal underworld. Violence, suspicion, constant watchfulness, willingness to change, became problems when he tried to be a loving husband. You cannot be both a violent crime boss and a devoted romantic. The two roles require completely different mindsets. Jim's romance with Dale also showed his age. At 42, he was no longer the young, hungry immigrant desperate to prove himself. He had already proven himself. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve. The fire that had driven him for decades was burning lower. He was tired of the constant watchfulness, the endless conflicts, the need to always be thinking several moves ahead. Dale offered him an escape from all that. With her, he could imagine a different life. A life where he was just a wealthy restaurant owner, not a crime boss. A life where he could enjoy the opera and fine dining without worrying about rival gangs or police raids. A life where he could finally relax. But that was a fantasy. Once you are in the underworld, you are never really out. The organization does not let you retire peacefully. Your rivals do not forget who you are. And if you become a blockage to the organization's growth, you become disposable, no matter how much you built, no matter how important you once were. Jim's love for Dale made him weak in ways his enemies had never been able to use before. It took his attention away from business. It made him seem soft. It gave men like Johnny Torrio the excuse they needed to act. In the cold calculation of organized crime, a boss who puts his wife ahead of the organization's interests is a boss who needs to be replaced. The tragedy is that Jim's wish for love and happiness, wishes that most people would consider normal and healthy, were not possible with the life he had chosen. He could not be both Diamond Jim, the gangster, and Jim Colosimo, the devoted husband. He had to choose, and he chose love. It cost him his life. But perhaps he would have made the same choice. Even knowing the results, those 3 weeks with Dale, on their honeymoon and imagining a future together, might have been the happiest of his whole life. If so, maybe he died content, even if he died young. Jim Colosimo died at age 42, murdered by his own organization. His body lying in a pool of blood on the floor of the restaurant he had built. It was a violent end to a violent life, but was it a failure? By normal measures, Jim was extremely successful. He had come to America with nothing and built an empire. He had made millions of dollars. He had achieved fame and respect. He had dined with politicians and opera stars. He had built institutions that would last longer than him. He had changed the direction of organized crime in America. He had, by any fair measure, succeeded, but success came at a terrible price. He had built his fortune on the suffering of others. Thousands of women trapped in prostitution, families destroyed by gambling addiction, a city corrupted by his bribes. He had made enemies who waited for any sign of weakness. He had created a monster, the Chicago outfit, that eventually ate him, and he died alone, shot by someone he almost certainly trusted. Denied even the dignity of seeing his killer's face, his young wife was left a widow. His ex-wife probably felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness. His brothers, who had abandoned him years ago, suddenly showed up to claim his wealth. His political allies moved on to new supporters within days. His gangster associates erased him from their thoughts almost immediately. Was it worth it? Would Jim, if he could speak from the grave, say that his life was a success? Would he make the same choices again? We cannot know. What we can know is that Jim's story shows a basic truth about organized crime. There are no happy endings. You either die violently, as Jim did, or you go to prison, as Capone did, or you live in constant fear, as Torrio did before finally retiring. The money and power are real, but they are temporary, and they come at a cost that can never be fully measured. Jim thought he had beaten the system. He thought he had achieved the American dream. He thought his political connections made him untouchable. He thought he could finally relax and enjoy his success. He was wrong about all of it. Jim Colosimo's murder on May 11, 1920, was one of the most important events in the history of American organized crime. It marked the change from one time to another, from the time of vice lords to the time of bootleggers, from old-school gangsters to modern crime syndicates. Before Jim's murder, organized crime in America was relatively small and local. There were gangs in major cities, but they worked independently, focused on traditional crimes like prostitution, gambling, and forcing people to pay. There was no national organization, no syndicate, no commission. After Jim's murder, everything changed. Johnny Torrio put his plan for large-scale bootlegging into action, making profits that were much larger than anything the old vice operations had created. Al Capone expanded that plan even further, building connections with gangs in other cities, creating nationwide delivery networks, creating what was basically a national criminal corporation. Jim's murder also established a rule that old bosses who would not change could be removed. This would happen again and again in the decades that followed. In the 1930s, Lucky Luciano and other young leaders killed or pushed aside the old mustache Petes who would not modernize. In later decades, bosses who could not change with the times found themselves replaced. Willingly or not, the murder method itself became influential. The killing was professional, quick, and untraceable. The killer was brought in from out of town, specifically for the job, then immediately left the city. This method of contract killing, hiring a professional killer with no connection to the victim, became standard practice in organized crime. The political effects were also significant. The fact that Jim's murder was never seriously investigated, even though it happened in broad daylight in one of the city's most famous restaurants, showed just how dishonest Chicago's political system had become. It showed that gangsters could literally get away with murder if they had the right connections and paid the right people. From a wider historical view, Jim's murder can be seen as marking the end of the Progressive era's attempt to reform American cities. The reformers had believed that dishonesty could be removed through better laws, better enforcement, and better public spirit. Jim's murder showed that dishonesty was so deeply rooted in Chicago's power structure that even a famous gangster could be killed without consequences. Today, more than 100 years after Jim Colosimo's murder, you can still walk down South Wabash Avenue in Chicago. The street has changed dramatically since 1920. The levee is long gone, its brothels and gambling dens replaced by apartments, businesses, and parking lots. The First Ward's Vice District is now just another Chicago neighborhood, impossible to tell apart from countless others. But if you know where to look, traces remain. The building at 2126 South Wabash Avenue still stands. Though it no longer holds a restaurant, the gold doorknobs are gone. The green velvet walls have long been painted over. The painted ceiling is hidden beneath dropped tiles. Most people who pass by have no idea they are walking past the place where one of American history's most important gangland murders occurred. There is a small historical marker, easy to miss. That notes the building's importance, but it does not tell the whole story. It does not mention the thousands of women whose exploitation paid for the building's construction. It does not mention the political dishonesty that allowed it to do well. It does not mention the trail of blood that led from this building to the creation of the Chicago outfit. Oakwood Cemetery, where Jim was buried in unholy ground, is now a historic landmark. Visitors come to see the graves of other famous Chicagoans. Most walk past Jim's simple headstone without stopping. There are no diamonds marking the grave. The man who loved showing off in life was given simplicity in death. Dale Winter's story had a happier ending. She lived to be 92, dying peacefully in 1985. Having outlived all the gangsters from that time, in her final years, she rarely talked about her short marriage to Big Jim Colosimo. It was a part of her life she had firmly closed. A dangerous past she had wisely left behind. The Chicago outfit, the organization Jim helped start, slowly faded over the decades. Federal prosecutions, internal conflicts, and changing times weakened it. By the early 2000s, it was a shadow of its former self, but it never completely disappeared. Even today, there are occasional arrests, occasional news stories about aging gangsters facing charges. The machine Jim built over 100 years ago is still somehow working. Johnny Torrio, the man who ordered Jim's murder, lived to be 75 years old, dying peacefully in Brooklyn in 1957. He had spent his final decades partly retired, occasionally advising younger gangsters, but mostly staying out of trouble. Unlike most mob bosses, he died in his own bed. Of natural causes, surrounded by family, he had proven that it was possible to succeed in organized crime and survive, but only by knowing when to step away. Al Capone, the most famous product of Jim's organization, died at 48 in 1947, his mind destroyed by syphilis. He spent his last years in Florida, unable to recognize friends or family, barely remembering the empire he had once ruled. It was a sad end for the man who had once been the most powerful gangster in America. Frankie Yale, a man who probably pulled the trigger that killed Jim Colosimo, was himself murdered in Brooklyn in 1928. He was shot in his car, killed by submachine gun fire from rival gangsters. Possibly ordered by Al Capone himself, the irony was not lost on observers. The man who had killed Big Jim died the same way, in a professional hit ordered by someone he had once worked with. The pattern repeated itself again and again in the decades that followed. Gangsters who rose to power through violence died through violence. Organizations that built themselves on dishonesty and crime eventually fell under the weight of their own violence. The empire that Jim Colosimo helped create left a trail of bodies that stretched across 100 years. Was it worth it? Did Jim Colosimo's life, his death, and the organization he created contribute anything positive to Chicago or America? That is a question each person must answer for themselves. What is impossible to deny is that Jim's story shows basic truths about America in the early 20th century. That the American dream could be achieved through criminal means. That political dishonesty was widespread and accepted. That using vulnerable people was profitable and largely unpunished. That violence was an acceptable business tool. And that the line between honest and dishonest power was often invisible. Jim Colosimo was a product of his time, a time when cities were dishonest, when immigrants were desperate, when vice was everywhere. But pretending to be moral was even more common. He understood the reality behind America's promises and myths. He saw the dishonesty and decided to profit from it rather than fight it. He recognized that the system was a game, and he played to win, and for a time he did win. He went from bootblack to king, from poverty to wealth, from nobody to somebody. He built something that lasted longer than him. He changed the course of history, however dark that history might be. Then on a spring afternoon in 1920, he walked into his own restaurant, splendid in white and diamonds, and was murdered by the machine he had helped create. 5 minutes. That is all it took to end Big Jim Colosimo's life and begin a new time in American organized crime. The bullet that killed him echoed through the decades, through the bootlegging wars, through the rise of the modern mafia, through countless murders and prosecutions and power struggles. That single gunshot on May 11th, 1920, marked a turning point. The moment when American organized crime went from being a local problem to a national force, from being about vice and dishonesty to being about big business and company structure. Jim Colosimo died, but what he built lived on, for better or worse, and mostly for worse. His legacy shaped American criminal history for the next 100 years. The bootblack from Calabria, who dreamed of a better life, achieved his dream, then paid the final price for that achievement. And somewhere in Oakwood Cemetery, under a simple headstone in unholy ground, Diamond Jim Colosimo lies silent. His diamonds buried with him, his empire carried on by others. His story a warning about ambition, change, and the high cost of success in the American underworld. The ghosts of South Wabash Avenue remember him still, and so ends the story of Big Jim Colosimo, a man who built Chicago's first true crime empire, only to be destroyed by his own success. If you enjoyed this deep look into Chicago's forgotten godfather, please hit that like button and share this video with any true crime fans you know. Your support means everything to this channel. What do you think? Was Colosimo a visionary who simply wanted out, or did his lack of concern lead to his downfall? Write your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your views on these stories. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more untold gangster stories coming your way. From the streets of New York to the speakeasies of Chicago, we are finding the true histories behind America's most famous criminals. Thanks for spending the last few hours with me. Whether you are falling asleep or just learning something new about history, I appreciate you being here. Until next time, stay curious and sleep well.